Hello, and welcome to my short video on some updates on Parable of the Sower. Uh, it can be hard to talk about literature in a asynchronous online course. Again, that's something that we would, talk about in a lively discussion in the classroom, but all is not lost. Reading a little bit every week and doing different exercises based on what we've read helps us a lot. But for now, I just kind of want to talk about, you've read the first 6 chapters at this point, I hope. And if you haven't, if you're keeping up with us, we're reading about 3 chapters every week, right? Last week we read chapters 1 through 3. And this week I want you to have read up to chapters 4 through 6. And if you haven't done that, I encourage you to pause this video, go and read chapters 4 through 6, and then come right back here, because all of the examples I'm about to use are going to be from chapters 4 through 6, and we'll do a little bit of review for chapters 1 through 3. Right. So Parable of the Sower, this is the first time I'm talking to you about it. I asked you to do some writing about it, some introductory writing, and now I get to discuss it with you. What a story, right? We have a protagonist who is living in a world that's only 5 years ahead of us, or 4 years ahead of us in the future. However, the book was written in the 80s, right? The book was written in the 80s and the 90s. So Octavia Butler had no idea what our world was going to look like. Instead, she created the world that she needed to create based on what was happening in the world at the time that Octavia Butler was writing, right? And she's given us this character, Lauren Olamina, and her community, the community of Robledo, and her unique situation, her unique views on God, her unique gift, curse of hyperempathy syndrome. I'm curious to know what you guys think about that. And in the first few chapters, where she's just setting the scene, really. She's giving us, first, the novel opens with that dream, right? Such an interesting dream where Lauren is teaching herself how to fly, and she has to either avoid a wall of fire or move through an open door, right? Which means nothing to us at first. But eventually we see, right, that Lauren's world is sort of on fire, right? And that she's ever looking for ways to move through it and survive, right? The other dream that happens at the beginning there is a conversation she has with her stepmother, a conversation about progress, a conversation about what progress looks like. And the mother believes that the city lights represented success and civilization. But Lauren, and the city lights are no longer there. Lauren sees the stars as a sign of civilization, or as a sign of progress, and what we should be striving toward. Right, it's a little bit of the old versus the new. Right, the younger generation thinking that the past is not something we need to build a foundation on, that we need to be building new, right? Um, Anyways, so those are the concepts that get laid out in the very first chapters, especially concepts about God, especially the dynamic between Lauren and her father. It seems like she says, my dad thinks I need more humility, right? And he's a reverend, and she's clearly a smart kid. So that dynamic is very obvious, right? This reverend wants his kid to be the best, and to be the best version of herself she can be, but she's a little bit stubborn. Maybe she's a little too smart for her own good. And the community that they live in. The community that they live in is, I'd say, pretty poor, but also in terms of the world that they live in, it's also pretty middle class, right? They're struggling a lot, but they're not struggling as much as the people who live in burned out husks of buildings or just live out in the streets. They're not well off as the people who live on the hill with their servants in their quarters, but they are also not destitute. So they represent the middle class. Octavia Butler has given us someone in the middle class of this world. One other theme that seems to be important here is the idea of the pursuit of science versus the pursuit of survival, right? We see that in the debate between whether or not the astronauts should be going to Mars and a president who wants to roll back science and business regulations, right? So those are the major themes that get laid out in the opening passages of chapter 3, or of chapters 1 through 3. Wow, that all took 6 minutes. Oh God, I'm trying to keep these these videos under 7 minutes. Okay, it's going to go on a little longer, so sit tight, have patience. So here are the elements of the novel that I want you to keep an eye on going forward, right? There are a few elements, right? The anatomy of this novel is such that you can kind of divide it up into parts that are all working together. First of all, the opening passages of each chapter. I know you don't have a physical book, but I do, and I can show you what I mean. So these opening passages: belief initiates and guides action, or it does nothing, right? Now, what these opening passages, right, they read like religious text. They read like deeply philosophical. They're almost entirely abstract language. But sometimes they have concrete language that are very helpful. But for example, the questions we want to ask ourselves with these opening passages, try to connect them with the events of the chapter that follows them. Try to figure out the rules of the language that they use. For example, in chapter 5, belief initiates and guides action, or it does nothing. This is at the beginning of the chapter in which Lauren tries to warn Joan that their community is not long for this world, right? And that they need to prepare themselves to live on the road. Now, belief initiates and guides action. I would say that Lauren's belief is initiating and guiding action in her, or it does nothing. I would say that Joan's belief that some force is going to come and save them, like the police, like the president, like God, is leading her to not act, right? So the debate here between these two is to act or not to act based on how bad things are getting, right? Which is constantly the question, right, in the world that we live in. So when reading these passages, after you read them, keep them in mind as you read the chapter that follows and try to connect those passages with what's happening in the chapter. The other thing that I want you to think about that's really important here is versions of God, right? In chapter 2 or 3, yes, in chapter 2, there's a whole, Lauren runs through every possible version of God that exists out there, right? And then she settles on her own. We can start to see her forming an idea of what God means to her. And it's very different, right? It's not necessarily a God with consciousness, right? It's more of a force of nature, right? And that version of God is what guides her. But she continues to use other people's versions of God to guide her as well. For example, when her father, after he yells at her for scaring Joan, he uses the story of Noah in his next sermon, who is given by God an opportunity to circumvent the end of the world, but only if he does a lot of hard work first, right? So Lauren's constantly considering different versions of God and how they inform her journey and the kinds of decisions that she's going to make. The other thing that's really important in this novel that we've seen time and again already in the first 6 chapters is models of community, right? Community is extremely important in this novel. How people participate in the community, whether or not they participate in the community, how things should be done. I think of the Payne and Parrish household, right? I think of Mrs. Sims, right, who kind of was a holy roller racist, but the community all came together to help her anyways. But then once she died and her relatives came, and Reverend Olamina offered the neighborhood to them, saying, "We all help each other out here." Payne and Parrish made it clear that we don't really have any interest in participating in your version of help. Right. There are the shooting practices in which everybody learns how to shoot. There is the family putting out the fire together. The community putting out the fire together. The patrols that circle the neighborhood, and they're fending off thieves. Right. How community works together is central to this book and the events of this book going forward. So keep an eye on that one. Trust is a really big one. Um, I'm just going to say that for now. Keep an eye on trust, right? Who can we trust? How many times does Lauren have to ask herself who she can trust? Survival and quality of life is another important element in this book. What do we do to survive? What level of living will we accept to be allowed? Will we accept to live, right? How bad can our life get? So, for example, when Lauren is trying to warn Joan about the fact that the wall is going to come down eventually and that they're going to have to hit the road, um, Lauren's like, read everything you can and gather a go bag. And Joan's response is like, what are we going to do out there? How are we going to live? What are we going to eat? And Lauren says, well, here's a book on what kind of grasses we can eat and the roots that that we can live off of, right? Which is like terrifying to Joan, who's like lived in relative comfort, and her response is one of fear, right? Can I live off of grass and roots just so that I can live? Joan's answer to that is no, right? That's not a level of survival that is tolerable for her. Or the conversation that Corey and Reverend Olamina have at the end of chapter 6, when they've had to chase away thieves with guns, and Corey asks, how far are we going to go? Are you going to kill thieves that come over the wall? And Reverend Olamina says, if we have to, right? And we will pretend and if the cops come, we'll say it was a break-in, and Corey says, we can't live this way. This is unsustainable, right? She wants to rely on the police to come and help her. And Lauren also recognizes that they can't live that way either, but she recognizes that her father is in a somewhat of a state of denial about the right way to live. That there is a fire in the kitchen, but they're ignoring it because they're in the living room, right? So the constant question of what level of survival am I willing to put up with just so that I can live my day-to-day life, is a question that we should keep an eye on in this book. Lauren's development as a person, right? Lauren is learning lessons every chapter. And we need to be watching her growth, right? That's going to be really important to our understanding of the overall goal of the novel. One example is when she scares the crap out of Joan, and she says, and then Joan tells on her and tells her mother, like, Lauren says the wall's going to fall and we're going to have to eat grass. And so naturally that gets back to Lauren's father. And he says, you can't scare people. You have to teach people. Don't tell people that bad guys are coming to get them. Teach them how to fight. Don't tell people that the wall's going to come down. Tell them to make a go bag in case there's an earthquake, right? Even though he still doesn't really believe what Lauren believes. And finally, connections to our world, right? How do we connect this book to our world? There are countless connections to our world in this novel. People taking the law into their own hands with their own firearms. The idea that only God could change the world and not climate, right? There's many climate deniers out there. Widespread joblessness, dirty water from fracking, widespread drug epidemic. We just got through the opioid epidemic, if you could even say we're through it. So these are the elements of the novel that I want you to keep an eye on going forward. And why do we do this? One more note about why we do this. We want to ask ourselves, what is being said here, right? When we take a piece of art, we want to understand, why was it made, right? What is it trying to tell us? And you can say that it, like, what is the author trying to tell us? But at a certain point, the author is not there, right? So it's in our hands to understand this piece of work. Okay, this video's gone on long enough. I hope that's been a little bit helpful. That's a little bit review to catch us up to chapter 6. All right, I will see you in the module.